Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. We have back with us today Dr. George Hariri, the Ask George episode. I love throwing the doctor in there because it pisses him off. George, how's it going?
Good. It actually doesn't make me mad. Not my preference, but yeah. I'm really excited for this episode because I think that we have a lot of our episodes are about encouraging growth and talking about like, wow, we're gonna grow. We're gonna tell you why growth is awesome. We're gonna talk about that. And there's also this underside that comes with when growth isn't going well, or when growth is not working, or maybe when somebody took on expenses of growth that didn't have the demand to support it, like the stress that comes with that. And so I think this will be a different tone to the episode, which is how to navigate the very hard situations that nobody talks about. And so I'm really excited to bring, to bring this content out there so that people can understand that, like, no, these are real things that people go through. This isn't stuff that doesn't exist. Like, these are real conversations that need to be had. And, it's not always fun.
Well, and this is where like season one of the podcast originally, the archived one now at this point, talking about this idea of like, it's okay if ownership isn't right for you. And sometimes it doesn't work out, especially if someone bought uninformed. They didn't do the due diligence. They get themselves into a situation that they're in over their head, or they partner with someone who ends up not being a good fit. And there's so much pain and shame in kind of admitting defeat, in like realizing either practice ownership isn't right for me and I need to get out of this situation, or I've overexpanded. I went to a second location, I've bought the wrong practice, and I feel now so behind. I feel like I'm 5 years behind in my career. Everyone else who bought the right practice and who's succeeding and crushing it, like they're so much further along, and it's really painful. And therefore, a lot of times we don't make the hard decisions. We kind of limp along, and we struggle. But I did want to start at the end of the last episode. I wanted to talk about this example, and I think it plays into it because of the conversation that I had. So there was a doctor that I talked with the other day who has a healthy, bustling practice, has expanded into basically 2.5 doctors between himself and a couple associates. I want to say 8 or 9 ops, and has purchased the ground for a 20 op build out, which, is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take
Yeah.
a lot of time. And then it's going to be a huge stressor to expand into this space. And he talked about, like, everyone talks about not going big enough and then expanding into the space, and the demand is there. Um, Attracting and retaining associates, I think that's the hardest part. And I think one of his thoughts is to partner with someone and bring them in on this, so then it's not all on him to take over if a doctor leaves. But I really had a hard conversation with him of like, you're making really good money right now. Your kids are in this phase that like they're kind of young to teenager phase. You got 5 kids. Have you asked your spouse if she has dreams? Like, has she been putting stuff on hold? Like, you're going to take on a whole nother workload of building this big thing, expanding into it, growing this kind of monstrous practice. Like, you could wait 5 or 7 years until your kids are like almost out of high school, and now you've got more freedom and time. And it was not whether or not he should do this. Actually, it kind of was, but it was also like the timing of this. And will you regret pouring into this when you've already got a 7-figure take home? You've already got a phenomenal lifestyle. You guys kind of live frugally. You're not like doing that. Like, why? So this is the kind of conversation that a lot of times people don't have ahead of time, and therefore they get into scenarios where the cost is higher than what they thought it would be, and their assumptions of where this was going are different than reality. But I want to get your take on the 20 op build out. If it took $3 million to do a $3 to $4 million to do a ground up build, to go from an 8 or 9 op practice into a 20 op practice, how scary would that be for you?
Yeah, so I think that there's 2 elements of this, right? You're doing 2 things at once. You're doing a massive real estate development investment, and then you're also doing a practice expansion. And so, I think that this episode, like almost a low-key sponsor, should be buyer's representation services that we offer, because like, it avoids so much of these like purchase the wrong practice type things. But I think at the same time, you need to do a feasibility study on both sides. And I may approach it differently than you, where if the feasibility, like, so for example, if I were to build a building and that building were to be able to sell for what I put into it to get it up and running, then I'd be very pleased with it, right? Because you're essentially, it's like there's two, if you're underwater in an investment, if you can't exit it for what you're in it for, right? So,
Which this is the theme of the episode. Like,
yeah.
that is the practice that you feel trapped in because you bought wrong, which once again is an advertisement for buyer's representation. So I think the real estate here is the same conversation as the practice you bought wrong.
Yeah, so let's just say, right, and you would look at, okay, what's the appraisal value for commercial real estate price per foot in this type of situation? You say, okay, if I were to do a lease purchase, a lease sale lease back, then what would I get out of that sale lease back, right? And so, like, if the value proposition is I take on a bunch of debt and I can get out of that debt in 6 months to a year, for what I'm in it for. And I get to move my practice to 20 operatories, potentially visible location, like, higher new patient flow. I like it. But if it's one of those situations where it's like, well, the building will be worth about 1 million less than it costs to build it, between the cost of the land, the cost of construction, which is, higher now than it ever has been. So I think that those are the things that I would want to do a very, very diligent commercial real estate feasibility analysis on, like, does the investment of $3 to $4 million to build an asset that is worth at least what I put into it, so that I can get out of it without, that's the whole thing. And I think, Richard, you're kind of hitting the nail on the head, right? It's like, if you can get out of the stuff, then it's not nearly as bad than if you're stuck in it, right? Because let's just say you build a building for 3.5 million, and an investor or somebody who would buy the building from you wouldn't pay any more than 2.5. Well, now you're on the hook for the $1 million. So you can't sell it unless you have 1 million cash, which you probably don't want to put into the building. So then you can't sell it until you pay down the million in the loan, or the million on your loan, which may be like 10 years, and that's not going to be a fun 10 years. So I would think that, from my perspective, I would want to make sure that the real estate component of this is what I would call equity positive, where at the end of the project, I have an asset that's worth more than what I'm in it for. So if that's not the case, then I have a much different feeling on this than if that is the case.
And this is great. And this is like where my anti-scale bias comes out,
Yeah.
which I have. Like, I am a little more risk averse, and I think I overestimate the lift of, like, the execution of this. If you've going back to last episode, if you've got a phenomenal coach, the demand is there in the market, you've got a really good office manager, and, like, the execution of scaling into this, you've already built a lot of the systems, you've already built a lot of that, then all of a sudden, like, it's not as scary to do this, versus, like, you don't have all those things in play. But
Yeah, so I think, so that's the first half, right? Is assess the feasibility from a commercial real estate side. The other half is assess the feasibility from a practice management side, right? Do I have the ability to attract dentists and patients to the sufficient degree to fill 20 operatories so that the practice can grow into that facility? If yes, then again, I would proceed. And I think that, like, I think there's two different things about the time of the life, right? Is like, when your kids are in college may actually be the worst time, because if you're paying for their college,
yeah,
then, like, that's a
higher
major no.
overhead time in your life. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like, if you look at, like, the progression of expenses, it's like your expenses in your personal life, if you're paying for your kids' college and you have 5 of them, like, that actually may be the most expensive time, and getting that up and running before then may actually make sense. And so I think that I would just do really strong feasibility, and you kind of need to do pessimistic feasibility, especially on the construction, right? Because your contractor, like, I've actually been in this situation. I bought a lot and I didn't develop it, and I lost a lot of money on this whole deal. And it was like, I have I have a thing of, like, top 4 things that I lost a lot of money on, and it made that list. So, like, this wasn't a good thing for me, and it brought a lot of unhappiness and feelings of stuck and all of that. And where I got, duped was, being told one thing on the entrance of the project from how much it would cost to build, and then getting deeper into the project, all of a sudden the cost to build goes up and up to the point where it was no longer feasible. So, like, that, I think you just need to be careful that you're really, really confident in those estimates. But I think that it's all about feasibility. Is the practice management side feasible? Is the commercial real estate feasible? If they're both feasible, then I'd proceed.
Yeah, so that right there, the due diligence to understand what am I getting myself into and what options do I have, then
Yeah,
applies to all of the rest of this. So the common scenarios that I've talked to where dentists really regret the situation they're in practice ownership is, I'll just list 3 that come to mind.
yeah,
Um,
and I'll list one after.
yeah. So number 1 is they've gotten into a partnership that they regret where there's different goals, there's different like pouring into the practice, there's different clinical things, expectations were one thing and the partnership isn't working and they feel very trapped due to the whole circumstance. Another is where a doctor has kind of done what you did at the beginning of Dental Moneyball in your practice, which is hired a doctor, and what we talked about in the last episode. They've prematurely hired a doctor before they had the patient base, and therefore they're anemic. I mean, this was the doctor I talked to last night who has worked with us. They had a second office. It was really a practice and a half, but they had 4 doctor days at this office with um, not a high patient count, like kind of a day and a half of hygiene worth, and there was 4 doctor days. But there's
Wow.
this like, I feel guilty cutting back on a doctor's days. Another situation recently, it was his brother who was the associate doctor there. And I was like, you don't have enough dentistry for the 2 of you. You need to either fire your brother or you need to cut him down to 2 days and you need to step back in. So that's the second situation partnership, prematurely hiring a doc. And then the last is they've just bought wrong. They just expanded into a multi-practice situation, and that second office was not what it was. Or the original practice, they bought a practice where the guy was doing full mouth rehabs on a small patient base, and as soon as you buy it, drive that car off the lot, it depreciates 50% of its value because you can't do that kind of dentistry, and it's all been tapped out in that patient base. So those are situations where all of those, what I see that's common in them is that there is a very hard decision and conversation to be made that is too painful to even look at. And therefore, it doesn't get made, and you feel trapped and stressed, overwhelmed and burned out, and you resent everything about your business, your life. It bleeds over to your personal life. I think those are the most destructive scenarios to be in as an entrepreneur, as a practice owner, as a clinician. Um, and they all come with some form of ownership that you get yourself into that you didn't really realize what you were signing up for.
So I think that it is so interesting. So I'm going to kind of maybe make my own list based on your list, right? So the first one, not the right partnership. I feel like that one, I agree with you on that. Causes tons of stress, makes it very hard to work, all of that. The second one is too many expenses for the amount of revenue that you have in a business that you operate, right? I'll just call it that. And that could be in many different
Could be
configurations.
hygiene, could be doctors, could be all sorts of,
And then I would split your last one. So bought the wrong practice is very different if it's the one that you own and operate as a single compared to a multiple. So like that's where I would look at the bought the wrong practice one. And that's actually the one I want to dive into. So it's like I think that like, bought the wrong practice is the most interesting one to me because it's if you're a single dentist, why is it the wrong practice? Solo first office, for example, like it's your first office. And then the second one is multi practice. I actually think that's the most common situation where a dentist has success at their own single site. It's their first, they have success, and they think more success equals more practices. So they go buy a second, and then the second just becomes a big pain for them to manage. It takes their time, it doesn't make money, it's in a negative equity situation, and they're like, what did I do here? Why am I in this situation? And then they're just trying to offload it, but it's tough because you're in a negative equity situation. So I actually think like that's the one to have the most discussion around. But I want to first talk about the first one. I'll tell you a story. So I was doing practice underwater a long time ago, and this guy had a 3 operatory practice, like just closed 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and then is on the show. And I'm like, well, what's your vision? A group practice. And I'm like, wait. So your vision is a group practice, which requires multiple dentists, and you bought a 3 operatory practice, which I'd argue is not even big enough to be a solo. And it's like he just bought it. And
Ugh,
it's like that's the last thing he wants to hear.
right.
And of course, that's the first thing I tell him. And so it's like it's one of those things that like, if you bought a practice that's incongruent with your vision, there's two challenging decisions to make. There's the first decision is, do I take the long and winding road to my vision? Right? And that's a deep commitment to the practice, right? I'm going to make it work here. I'm going to grow my patient base out of 3 operatories, and then I'm going to move to a 6, 7 operatory facility, and I'll have the group practice, right? That's one path. And the other path is to be like, oh, you know what? Oops. And I'm going to like maybe ramp it for a year, sell it, and then move on, right? And why am I saying ramping for a year? Well, it's what Richard talked about before. It's this whole concept that you have to get out of the thing, right? So it's like when you buy a practice, you took on the price of the practice plus some working capital. So for you to get out of that, you have to, oftentimes you start ownership in a negative equity position. So in order for you to exit ownership without, needing to pay a lot of money back to the bank in a lump sum, you're going to have to grow the business of some type to get you back into a positive equity position so you can walk away. And so, like, I actually think the owner operator who buys the wrong practice is the simpler version, right? Because it's within your own hands.
Yes.
The guy he can hustle for a year, he can do his best, be efficient, grow the practice, and then, exit it, and then hopefully somebody who buys it wants to have a low overhead, right? That 3-op practice offers a low overhead, simple, like consistent income. And, for the right dentist, that could be an attractive opportunity. And so I think that, I would encourage people in all of these situations. So there's this saying that I have internally, are we building on top of broken? And if you're building on top of broken, it's not, you're wasting effort, right? So if you think about it, right, if this partnership isn't working and you're building on top of broken, the partnership will always be broken. So the building on top of broken, you're always building on top of broken, and you're not have a solid foundation. Your efforts are some level of wasted, inefficient. It's not going to get you exactly what you're looking for. If your expenses are too high, that's a whole different situation, right? But you can fix that one way or the other, grow your top line or cut people. But the one where you bought the wrong practice, am I going to stay in this practice for like this person who bought the 3 operatory practice? They could scale it within the confines of its walls, sell it, and buy a group practice, and then maybe 2 years later they could get that thing to where they want. So they could be 5 years away from their vision between the 2 practices, or they could spend 10 to 15 years trying to turn that 3 operatory practice into the group practice that they're looking for. And that's a building on top of broken, long, winding, inefficient road. And so I think in a lot of these situations, the hardest part is what you talked about, which is confronting what's not working and having a willingness to rip it off. And I think that people don't like that at all. And it's the worst thing you could do in my suggestions and advice would be to avoid. Like when you're avoiding the problem, the things you avoid that you don't want to deal with just grow. I don't know why. It's just like it becomes a bigger problem in your mind. Every time you get a reminder for it, your body has some reaction. Like you need to confront what's not working. And I think that like the more you avoid what's not working, the more it'll continue to haunt you. And like that's just, you got to look it straight in the face one way or another. You don't necessarily, and I think the hard part for me, last thing I'll say on this before I let you kind of chime in, is when I'm dealing with a situation that I don't like, early on in my life, I used to get out of them very quickly. Yeah, just exit. And, something that's kind of I've learned with time is you can't always exit situations quickly. Like in this situation of buying the 3-op practice, you can't get out next month. You have a real obligation that practice, you have obligations that come with ownership. And so just looking at it, acknowledging it, and taking steps towards exiting in a longer time frame is liberating in its own way. So you feel like there's an end date. If there's an end date that's defined and it's like it's there, it makes it easier to withstand the time between now and the end date. So, Richard, that's kind of what I have before I get into the second practice type situation.
Well, looking back as I described my three, and I agree with your delineation on the last one. Um, I've seen people where it's all three. And they've bought a practice or multiple practices with a partner, which did not work out because that partner didn't perform. They were a massive impedance to leadership. They weren't producing, they weren't showing up, or they got injured and they couldn't practice anymore. Now we're stuck with more overhead than the practice can sustain, and we're upside down, and we can't exit. Um, and that's like this trifecta of just crushing, like, what do I do now? And one of the exercises that I would walk through is, okay, realistically, what are your options? Like, all the way to you could declare bankruptcy. Like, you could
Yeah,
take it all the way to that end. And
but that's not a good option.
it's not a good option because you can't own again anytime soon. But everything short of that, I think one of the things that we have seen is how quickly someone can grow a practice that is the right opportunity. Like,
Yeah.
in my mind, if everything hit the fan and I had to start over from scratch, but I just bought a really primed to grow practice and grew it over a period of 3 to 4 years, you all of a sudden have so much freedom and so many options. And so, like, once you see that, you can't unsee it. And that's the position that you and I have a perspective of, is like, man, what you can do with one good size, healthy multi-doctor practice, 2 to 3 doctor practice is incredible. And it doesn't take that long to get there if you'll buy right. And so if you're finding yourself in the position where you can never get there based on the real estate, the current situation, the financial, or it's like a 5 to 10 year journey to right what's broken, then once you look all the way to the extreme options of, like, I'm willing to quit this partnership, to sell it at a loss, all of a sudden it opens you to having a lot of hard discussions that are not as bad as that worst case scenario. And even in that worst case scenario, you're still a dentist with a freaking dental license. You're still going to be able to eat food and provide for your family. Like, there are worse things that happen to people all the time. You feel awful because of, like, what you missed out on and what you could be doing. But at the end of the day, like, you can make $200,000 to $300,000 not as an owner, realistically, if you find the right opportunity, and still live a great life. And so, taken all the way to the extreme then gives you permission to then go to your partner and say, I can't do this. Here's the situation. This needs to change. Or go to your lender or go to a broker and really explore what your true options are, because you've walked down the path mentally to the worst case scenario. Um,
Yeah.
anyways,
That's actually a great point. So, one of the things that I've learned, and I'll shout out Austin here as my teacher on this one, is write a detailed worst case scenario. Like, so I actually keep it in a document. And so like I have this document on my phone, which is like the worst case scenario professionally for me. So like, I declare bankruptcy, everything goes to zero, like the worst possible scenario. What would I do? And you just like it's a very unpleasant exercise when you're doing it, right? You're like, okay, like if you're in this and you're listening and like some of the things we're talking about really resonate with you for some reason, write out what is the worst case scenario and make it as bad as possible. And then pretend like you're in that scenario and talk about what you will do. And, barring health related worst case scenarios,
right.
right? You're going to be breathing. You're going to wake up in the morning. You're going to go to sleep at night. You're going to, like, if you're a dentist, you're going to have a way to support yourself. And it's like, once you kind of like sit with it for a while, and like, I know what I would do in my worst case scenario because I actually have it in a document. And it's like, it's like, oh, this is what I would do. And it's like your escape plan. It's like, if worse comes to worse and everything is terrible and everything you own goes to zero and you declare bankruptcy or whatever the worst case scenario is, what would you do? And if you know that and you're like, okay, well, I mean, this isn't ideal, obviously. I don't like the worst case scenario, but I'm good. Like, I'm alive, my kids are healthy. Like, if we're talking about just professional stuff, like, then those things should be in place, right? We're just talking about dental practice management worst case scenario. So it's like, I think that in the dental practice management worst case scenario, the things that matter more are still there. And so I think that, like, when you have that mindset and you've adopted that, then you're like, okay, worst comes to worst, I'm good. Once you have that, then there's like this weight that, because what happens, your mind goes down the worry train. And it's like, what if this happens? Then this happens. Then this happens. Then this happens. And then this. And then this. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And so it's like, just take that train all the way down to the bottom and be like, you know what? At the bottom, I'm good. So like this whole train is fine. And then I think the thing that, like, you know, when you're in one of these scenarios, so I'm just going to pick one, right? Just so we can be tangible. Like, we have a dentist who has one practice that's going well. It's their driver. They go to work 4 days a week. They make money. It's great. They have a second practice they're underwater in. They bought it for a certain amount. They put an associate in there. The practice tanked a little bit.
It's
So
not
now
growing.
it's not growing. It's losing money. So, like, let's just say they're sending $10,000 a month from their practice that's making money to the practice that's losing money. And they can't sell it because it would sell for less than their loan, right? So it's like you have this $10,000 per month, just like annoyance that's just eating at you. You hate it. It sucks. And it's like, well, now you're going to work and you're like, I got to work in the first practice. What if the first practice doesn't make money? How am I going to send money to the second practice, right? You go all the way down. You deal with the worst case scenario. Then you've got to fight your way out of these situations, right? Like, in most of these situations, it's not like, because in these situations, what makes them particularly hard is the feeling of stuck. And so you need to get clear on, why am I stuck? And like laser focus on that. And in this situation, you're stuck because the second practice is losing money. That's the source of the problem. And so you need to laser your focus on, how do I make this second practice not lose money, right? So Monday through Friday, 4 days a week, you're working in the first practice that's keeping the whole thing afloat. And then in your off time, and I'm sorry to say this, but you have to be fighting and grinding in that second office to go from losing money to breaking even. Once you go to breaking even, there's a huge relief that comes from it, because all of a sudden the situation becomes more sustainable. Then you fight a little harder. You get the practice to grow its top line to the point where you can sell it. Then you exit from the thing, you wash your hands from it, and then you look back on it, you're like, that was a terrible experience, but at least it was in the past.
Yeah.
Right? So like the key to these types of situations is fighting your way out of them. And that often comes from identifying the biggest source of the problem and attacking that problem so that it is no longer a problem. And I'm just going to tell a personal anecdote here. So I did this annoyingly terrible thing of buying a bunch of cars to rent them on Turo. And I had
Was
this
it
situation,
last
right?
episode or this episode you're talking about? I think at the beginning of this episode, you're like, that was in my top four. I was like, is a
Yeah, no,
property
there's
in
a lot of things in my
Mexico
top four.
and
Yeah.
Turo, are they
Yeah,
also
so
in the top four?
so the Turo is in there. And I had this just annoyingly, it was terrible. It was the same exact situation. I was just wiring money from good to bad,
How many
just
cars
each
again?
month. 20.
Okay.
So I have a 20 car fleet. And, I was like, all right, like, I'm on the loan for these cars for a while. So like, I'm on the hook. I got to take care of it. And so what I did was I went in there and I just, like, ripped out the management person that was in there, operated it myself, like, got in there, so now when you go on Turo, you'll see my picture. Like, I have my own profile. I'm an R-star host. I have my cars. I, like, streamlined the business, and I got it to the point where it's break even now. And it's like, well, break even, like, I can deal with break even. Break even is sustainable, right? It's like, it's just better when it's break even. And it's just one of those things that, like, it wasn't easy to get there. I have all kinds of stories on that process, and it was brutal, but, like, I just kept fighting. I kept staying in it and ultimately found my way out. And, like, that's what happens when you get yourself in these types of situations, is there's often, like, you're like in the ground in a hole, and you kind of have to climb your way out, and it's not easy, but, like, you have to do that to get yourself in a situation that is more sustainable. And so I think oftentimes it takes dealing with the worst case scenario, identifying the root of the problem, addressing the root of the problem, and then exiting. right? Like that should be kind of the workflow. And the worst part is that like fixing the root of the problem step, because that's like where you're working the hardest, still losing the money, and like it's just not fun. But ultimately, like you have to have that attitude to get yourself out of some of these challenges.
One last question with this to wrap up this episode, and I think, you know, if we had more time, we could talk through more of the specifics. But ultimately, what you just said is usually the path out. There's also a path of admitting defeat, um, and sometimes that is admitting defeat of, like, you know, grinding it out and selling it. But sometimes we make agreements and we can't continue to fulfill those agreements. And there's kind of different philosophies of like, I've agreed to this, so I'm going to do it no matter what, or I'm a quitter, or I'm a failure if I don't live up to this. Whether that's a partnership agreement, whether that's a loan, whether that's, you know, whatever it is. But I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest questions for me, and from you as a reformed pivoter, I want to hear your perspective.
Reform pivoter who's put myself in situations that I can't pivot out of.
Yes, exactly. Unpivotable pivoter is this concept of like, how many years of my life am I willing to sacrifice being miserable for this?
Oh, yeah.
And that's where, like, you can't get that time back. And so when you've made a mistake in agreeing to something that you didn't understand when you agreed to it, and you don't see a positive path out. Like, there is not a path to break even or sustainability. Like, it's this long, slow bleed that is going to be on the brink for years, and you're going to feel trapped for years. That's when, in my mind, you need to widen your worst case scenario document, to look at more options and not feel like making a hard decision is failure and I'm a quitter. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would ask myself, what are the consequences of negging on my agreement, right? So like, and like there's some, and I think that that's very dependent on the nature of the agreement. So like, let's just say it's an agreement with a bank, right? That you don't want to fulfill your end of that agreement. Well, in that situation, like, you know, you're going to have a bankruptcy type consequence, and there's going to be like a 7-year period where you are going to be like handicapped in terms of what you can do, right? So it's like, you kind of got to say, is the pill that you have to swallow to do that, is that something you're willing to stomach for the consequences, right? So I would really get clear on the consequences, and like certain times I would absolutely can fight. Like I would not, like if it's a bank who can declare bankruptcy on you, and like, you know, your credit's going to get shot. Like in this country, it's just really hard to operate without good credit and with that on your record. So like I would fight through those. But if it's like a partnership agreement or something that like, you know, it's not going to affect my credit, I'm good, then yeah, I would more seriously consider the like the negative consequences. But I think it's, consider the negative consequences of quitting. And if you're good with the negative consequences, then for sure, I mean, quitting is a great thing in the right situation because you get yourself out. You know, but I think that's like the theme of the episode is find a way out, right? Like don't, the worst thing you could do is continue trying to make it work when it's not going to work.
That is the recipe for suffering. So the last piece of this, and this is just to wrap it up, you're going to need perspective on this that doesn't come from you. You're going to need to have a conversation
Yeah.
with someone else who has been in this circumstance or who has helped people navigate this and can look at it and say, yeah, this is what I see. And this is what I would do in your circumstance. Here's your realistic options. Or I do see a path where you can grind it out and you can come up for air and there's hope on the other end of it. Even though you can't see it, let's get really, you know, ruthless and tactical and gritty. But in my life, I've had a hard time seeing those pathways when I'm in it. And it's taken people who've given me perspective, who care about me, who know the circumstances and are willing to offer their advice. So that's my last piece on all of this is get another set of eyes that really care about you and have expertise to give you good advice.
Yeah. Last thing I'd say is, you know, shared practices, like the best thing we do is help people in these types of situations. So like, for example, the second practice that you can't grow, coaching. or, buying the right practice, buying the wrong practice, buyer's representation services, right? Like we have a whole company built around helping people out of these types of situations on the practice management side. And so, yeah, I mean, you don't have to go through this stuff alone anymore. There's people out there to help you, and oftentimes it makes it much better.
And I would say this is where people say I can't afford coaching. This is
Yeah,
where you can't afford not to do coaching. Like
totally.
you cut anything, you pick up a Saturday at another office and like, start, working on the side so you can afford your coaching bill, because otherwise you're never going to, you put it on a credit card. You do something rash, and you hear so many great entrepreneur stories of back against the wall, this many hundreds of thousands or, tens of thousands in debt, and they make it work. They come back, and man, coaching will get you there. So,
Totally.
okay,
Well,
George, this has been great. You want to wrap it up?
yeah, I mean, thanks for listening to another episode of Ask George. And, I think this one is like, if any of this resonated with you, reach out for help. I'm absolutely certain that there's something that we can do to help you. So please reach out, talk to Suzanne, and I'd highly recommend that.
Take care.